to the Global Seminar of the Global Columbia Collaboratory. I am Shannon Marquez, Dean of Global Engagement at Columbia University, and I'm so honored that you join us today for an important conversation about the emotional legacy of forced migration with expert panelists who are all stepping into the Collaboratory today, continuing our Global Seminar series on Afghanistan. And now, before we begin, and especially for those of you joining us for the first time today, I want to provide a bit of background about the Global Columbia Collaboratory. With the disruption caused by the pandemic, Columbia University Center for Undergraduate Global Engagement, in partnership with the Columbia Global Centers and Columbia World Projects, launched the Global Columbia Collaboratory as a virtual exchange initiative to support students around the world. The Collaboratory brings students, thought leaders, and educators together, promotes cross-cultural communication, and enhances skills and global competence to allow students to reflect, ideate, and collaborate to empower them to make a difference in the world. Students have participated from over 32 different countries and are drawn from all 3 undergraduate schools at Columbia, representing over 30 majors. And we also have students participate from Sciences Po in Paris, Trinity College Dublin, Tel Aviv University, and the City University of Hong Kong, all schools where we also have dual degree programs. Using smartphones and laptops to access the Collaboratory Exchange platform, students form a community of global thinkers and problem solvers through participation in themed global seminars featuring international speakers, such as our seminar today, as well as facilitated reflection, ideation, and collaboration activities. As learnings and perspectives are shared across the Collaboratory students form project teams and receive funding to collaborate to tackle specific global issues and topics of interest. And the Collaboratory serves as an incubator for bringing ideas into reality and promoting new projects and innovative solutions to global challenges. Now, we are thrilled that undergraduate students from all over the world have been actively engaged in the Collaboratory every semester since it was launched in May of 2020. And we currently have a spring cohort of 56 Collaboratory students joining us live today. Welcome to all of you. Now, I encourage the global audience to submit questions to the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And again, I want to welcome everyone to this Global Columbia Collaboratory Seminar. And I want to thank all of our partners and esteemed panelists. We are so pleased to be working directly with the Columbia Global Centers for these seminars. And at this time, I want to introduce Safwan Masri, Columbia University Executive Vice President for Global Centers and Global Development, who will give some introductory remarks and introduce our moderator today. Safwan.
Thank you very much, dear Shannon. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. I'm in Jordan. I know that Jonas is in Copenhagen, and there are people joining from New York and from elsewhere. It really is my pleasure to welcome you to this second of our 3 webinars exploring the regional and global implications of recent developments in Afghanistan. Over the span of this series, we're addressing topics of great concern: refugees and migrants, human rights, especially women's rights, to education, domestic politics, and global power relations. Now, note that I said our interest is in recent developments, and yet the film we are introducing today as part of our discussion was essentially a generation in the making. Perhaps one of the most devastating facts about the current situation in Afghanistan is that it is not really new. We know the story. If we are of a certain generation, we've lived with it since it started in the 1970s. If we are lucky, we do not know it in the first-hand manner of the film's protagonist, Amin Nawabi. But as Amin's friend, the filmmaker Jonas Poher Rasmussen, now Oscar-nominated Jonas Poher Rasmussen, I have to say, to me personally, what's more exciting about the Academy Awards evening is the day that they announce the nominees, because that's all about hope, right? There's a lot of uncertainty, but it's about sort of who made the cut. And it almost doesn't matter who at the end wins, unless it's you, right? So to be nominated is incredible. And I think if I'm not mistaken, Flee got 3 nominations for the Oscars, including for Best Director. So Jonas in the movie prods and pokes, and we are for a time inside the head of this young man, Amin, who was forced as a child to flee everything he knew, to leave his home and his country, to put his life in the hands of human traffickers and end up in some foreign place hoping to find safety. Amin's story makes clear the toll of this possession. There is a scene in the film in which the people fleeing are drawn as white outlines, a little blurry, to show motion, but also suggesting the fuzziness of boundaries. The figures are empty, ghost-like, and they could be any of us. From your place on the earth, we are torn from ourselves. We're torn from our places on the earth, while making evident the erosion of trust in humanity that Amin experienced. He also experienced a lot of trust and faith in humanity. I don't want to give away too much, but one of my favorite scenes was the one in the back of the truck with that other young Afghan. But in any case, this also universalizes the story. It invites us to imagine ourselves in the position of the desperate refugee stumbling through enemy territory in a place we thought was home. Now, Amin's story is further complicated and enriched, I think, by his awareness from a very young age that he is attracted to men, an identity that is denied legitimacy in Afghanistan. The filmmaker, Jonas, probes at this. What is home to you, he asks, knowing that thus far, Amin is yet to be completely comfortable anywhere. His story as a refugee is also the story of an outcast, and he needs to be honest about all of that before he can truly ever be at home in the world, and most importantly, with himself. I don't want to give away any spoilers, as I already mentioned, but I feel that I may already have done that. But there's a scene with Amin's brother, Abbas, in Sweden that is pivotal and absolutely gorgeous. And, really, I mean, it brings literally tears to my eyes. So much of it touched me personally. I saw a piece of me in Amin and in his story, and I'm grateful to you, Jonas, really grateful for bringing us so close to this story, which is both heart-wrenching and beautiful at once. The journey to safety is not necessarily about finding a hospitable host country or a place of safety and refuge. Of course, these are critical, but they are not enough. How do we find a way back to ourselves after having been reduced to an object? How do we transform these stories from ones of personal liberation and triumph into something broader, challenging the global culture? So to help us answer these and other questions related to the emotional toll of forced migration, I am really pleased to introduce our moderator, Taylor Hirschberg, who will in turn introduce our esteemed panelists. Now, Taylor is so full of energy, and from the moment he landed at Columbia, he got in touch with me, and even though we haven't met in person yet, we've done so much together, and we share so much in terms of work perspectives and values and things that we want to do and try to do, and that he's done a lot more than I have to try to make the world a better place. So I'm especially proud, Taylor, that we're doing this together today. Taylor is a human rights activist and a Hearst Endowed Scholar at the Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health. Prior to Mailman, he worked as a humanitarian for Médecins Sans Frontières, and recently, Taylor has been a part of the evacuation efforts of LGBTQI+ Afghans and has worked with other diasporas, including from Venezuela and Syria. In addition to his humanitarian work, Taylor is a wartime journalist who writes on topics of forced migration, LGBTQ+ world events, and literature. And if Monette Zard is watching, Monette, thank you for Taylor. Taylor, over to you.
Thank you so much, Safwan. And yes, Monette, thank you as well. I'm really happy that everyone's here today. Super excited to have you. And this is going to be an amazing panel. So I do want to start out and talk a little bit about migration. So Migration has taken on an increasing complexity as I'd say one of the main marks of contemporary time. Refugees, asylum seekers, internally displaced persons, stateless peoples, labor migrants, and more recently, ecological refugees are all rolling into one massive phenomenon, signifying population shifts in both geopolitical and geoeconomic contexts. Among this exist diasporas. More specifically, a diaspora born in Afghanistan that has been present since the beginning of the Afghan-Soviet War in 1979. The Afghan diaspora has seen the complexities of forced migration for nearly 40 years, thus warranting a pedagogic approach and a discussion among experts that uses this film as a foundation to discuss the themes addressed in the film. And that's why I'm super thrilled to introduce you to our esteemed and award-nominated panelists today. So, Jonas Rasmussen is a Danish-French film director born in 1981. He debuted in 2006 with the acclaimed TV documentary, Something About Afghan, followed by a series of radio documentaries from around the world. He graduated from Danish Film School Super 16 in 2010. His feature film debut, Searching for Bill, a mixed documentary and fiction, won him the Nordic Docs Award at Copenhagen Docs and the International Competition Prize at Doc Aviv. In November 2015, he premiered his documentary, What He Did, which again won awards, the prestigious International Federation of Film Critics at Thessaloniki Film Festival in 2016. And then of course, Flee, an animated documentary about a close friend, was selected for the Cannes 2020, won the Grand Jury Prize at Sundance, the Best Doc Prize at Gothenburg, and the Crystal Award at Annecy, the BAFTA. He's also a fellow GLAAD Award nominee, and as of yesterday, a 3-time Oscar nominated in Best International Feature, Best Animated Feature, and Best Documentary. And I believe that trifecta is the first time that's ever happened. So next, I'd like to introduce Miriam Ghani, a friend and also someone who we've been working together to help evacuate many of the Afghans. So Miriam is an artist, writer, and filmmaker whose work operates at the intersections of war, trauma, memory, identity, migration, language, and loss. Her feature-length documentary, What We Left Unfinished, premiered at the 2019 Berlin and is now streaming on the Criterion Channel and DocuSeek. Her multi-channel work and photographs are currently featured in a solo exhibition at the Schneider Museum of Art in Ashland, Oregon. Ghani has received numerous honors and fellowships around the world, including the inaugural Storyteller Award from the Center for Constitutional Rights. She also teaches film at Bennington College and has worked for the past decade to preserve and disseminate Afghan cinema, and is currently active in efforts, like I said, to support Afghan artists at risk. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Madeline Garlick, Chief of the Protection Policy and Legal Advice Section in the Division of International Protection at the Office of United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. In 2018, she served as UNHCR's Assistant Representative for Protection in Iraq. She was responsible for UNHCR's liaison to EU institutions on asylum law and policy from 2004 to 2013. She has also served with the UN Department of Peacekeeping Operations in Cyprus and with the Commission for Real Property Claims of Refugees and Displaced Persons and Office of High Representative in Bosnia. She teaches at Sciences Po, Paris, at the Refugee Studies Center at Oxford University and at College of Europe and Burgess. She holds a PhD from Radboud University in the Netherlands, a master's degree in law from Cambridge University in the UK, and an arts and law honors degree from Monash University, Australia. She is qualified as a barrister and solicitor in Victoria, Australia. Next, we've got Dr. Claire Green, psychiatric and substance use epidemiologist in the program of forced migration and health at Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health. Her research focuses on improving the implementation and effectiveness of mental health and substance use interventions and humanitarian settings by integrating methods in epidemiology, intervention evaluation, implementation science, and system science. She's involved in research to evaluate and scale up mental health and substance use interventions among displaced populations in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. In her work, she collaborates with governmental and non-governmental organizations, multilateral agencies, and academic institutions. She completed her postdoctoral fellowship in global mental health implementation science at Columbia University, received her PhD from Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and her master's in public health from Yale School of Public Health. So that's what an esteemed group of people. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here. So Jonas, I'm going to start with you. How are you feeling today?
I feel great. It's been a wild couple of hours for these last 25 hours.
How is your family feeling? How are they? What was their reaction been so far?
No, I mean, everyone just feels it's crazy, you know. We've dreamt of this, but now it happened, and it's just overwhelming, and it's been a busy couple of days.
Yeah, I bet. So I'm going to dive right in and ask you a question. So what about Amin's story really inspired you to create this documentary, animated documentary?
Well, you know, I didn't know the story when we started. So it really came from, you know, my curiosity about my friend. I met him when I was 15 and he was 16. I grew up in this very small village here in Denmark. And one day he arrived all by himself and stayed in foster care with a family just around the corner from where I lived. And, you know, we started meeting up at the bus stop every morning, going to high school, and became good friends. And I was, of course, already back then curious about how and why he came, but he didn't want to talk about it. And I, of course, respected that. And then from there, you know, our friendship grew. But this story was kind of this black box in there, you know, this story of his past was with him all the time. I just didn't realize how much it kind of weighed on his shoulders. And then 15 years ago, I asked him if I could do a radio documentary story about him. I have a background in radio. And he then said that he knew that he would have to share his story at some point, but he didn't feel quite ready yet. But when he would be ready, he would like to share it with me, and then we could do something about it. And then again, years passed, and all of a sudden this opportunity to do something, to do an animated doc came up. And I thought maybe this was a good way to tell his story. And I asked him, I met up with him and asked him again. And he was really intrigued by the fact that he could be anonymous behind the animation, because, you know, what you see in the film, what you hear in the film is the very first time he talks about these stories. And it's not easy for him. It's really his life trauma that comes out here. So to him to kind of be able to keep control over when he wanted to talk about it and not having to small talk about these things, you know, in the supermarket or at work, was really what enabled him to start to open up this black box that had been there all along, all these years.
So how's he feeling about all of the nominations of the film Flee?
No, you know, I called him up just when we when we knew that we were nominated. And, you know, to him, it's just surreal. He was like, he was at work and just took a break from work and had lunch while watching, you know, the live stream from the Academy. And then he saw it and then he had to go back to work. So it's really, it's surreal, but, you know, he's really happy that this kind of story is out there. You know, him growing up, he didn't have a lot of stories he could kind of relate to, not a lot of, you know, nuanced refugee stories. So the fact that he'd been able to give his story and give that kind of story to all the other people who have similar backgrounds really means a lot to him.
Awesome to hear. That's, I bet he's feeling really, it's probably a really surreal feeling. So nearly 82 films on migration have either been nominated for an Oscar or have won the nomination. Why do you think the topic of migration has received so much recognition in the format of film?
You know, there's a lot of refugees right now, and there's so much, as you talked about in the beginning, like there's different kind of refugees, and it's in the news all the time. So I think it's something that's very kind of present in people's minds. And it's a major issue. And I think a lot of people see that and realize that, okay, especially with what happens with the climate right now, that this is something that could happen to everyone. It's not just someone in a far country, it could really happen to everyone. So I think it's on people's minds a lot.
I agree. So why do you think people have taken to the animated documentary in this case? What do you think about the process of animation for this film that has really captured everyone's heart?
Well, first of all, of course, there's the fact that we could really try to bring back the past alive in animation, and because it's a story about memory and trauma, and I think with the animation we're able to be somewhat more honest towards those feelings, those traumas. Whenever Amin started to talk about his traumas, the style of the film changes into this more kind of expressive and surreal style of animation, and I think it felt more honest. And then also, we're exposed to so many of these kind of stories all the time in the media. We see a lot of people, a lot of human faces who struggle. And talking for myself, I had to block things out. I can't take everything in because then I would be able to get out of bed in the morning. So I think the fact that, you have this animated layer between that you don't see the real face kind of eases. It gets easier to kind of listen to, and when you start to listen, you start to experience more. And so I think maybe also because animation is something that we all grew up with in our childhood. I think maybe there's a more kind of clear path to your heart through animation than if you have to kind of face, real human beings telling the same kind of stories.
Yeah, sorry, Taylor, if I may. I mean, I love that, and I love the juxtaposition also of real life footage and news footage and other types of footage. It gave it a realism, and then with the animation, that also made it very, very real. And I hear everything that you're saying, and it also brought perhaps a little bit of innocence into it. So, for example, the winks that he would get on television, you could not replicate that if you were doing it in real as opposed to an animated fashion. Sorry, I just wanted to throw that in there.
No, I completely agree with you. Like animation tells it touches us, I guess, vulnerability in all of us. You get to capture the moments that you often miss. So that brings me to the next question. So what were the challenges specifically with doing a documentary and animation that you haven't had perhaps in other experiences of, creating documentaries or film?
Well, first of all, I hadn't done animation before, so it's a craft that people spend years and years to learn. I didn't animate anything myself, but just to kind of understand the craft and the process of animation, which is very different from doing normal documentaries, was difficult and took time. And even more so, animation is really expensive, and there's not a lot of money in documentary. So to kind of fund, it's a little boring, but to kind of fund an animated documentary is really difficult because you go to these kind of pitching forums and say, I have this idea for a documentary, and they all think, okay, this is great, and then they look at the budget and they say, oh, this is never gonna happen. So it took a long time to convince people that this was the only way to tell the story and that it could be done. But at the end, I actually think it was quite good because I had to learn the process, but also because it was a slow process of Amin to slowly open up and start to share his story. And I did interviews with him during almost 5 years. So for him to kind of be more and more ready to share his story and go deeper and deeper into these memories, the time was much needed.
I'm so happy that you brought this to the world, and it's especially touched me and the work that I've done. My last question here for you is: has anyone in Afghanistan been able to see the film that you know of?
Not that I know of, no, not yet. I've had someone approach me from Pakistan, but not from Afghanistan yet. But I think now with the Taliban there, it's going to be difficult to get at least a legal distribution in Afghanistan. But I surely hope that someone will download it illegally and put it on a wall somewhere and show it to Afghans.
Everyone, you just heard him say that. So yes, we hope for the same thing as well. Thank you, Jonas. So, I'm going to speak with you, Claire, next, if that's okay. So, the feelings I got from this really had to do with a journey from trauma and to wellness. And I really feel like one of the major themes of the movie had to do with, Amin's mental health and identifying different ways to cope. So, wanted to start and ask you, is that a theme that you saw, and in your other work with other diasporas, have you seen similar common themes?
Yeah, thanks, Taylor. And first of all, thanks for inviting me to be here. It's such a pleasure to be part of this incredible panel. I completely agree. I, of course, picked up the mental health themes in the film quite immediately. And I think to answer your question about, are there differences? I would say yes and no. I think that the film did a really beautiful job of highlighting some of the kind of shared experiences that actually transcended the trauma narrative that I think we often get stuck in when talking about displacement and humanitarian settings. To me, the things that stood out were themes that I think are very relatable, profound loss and uncertainty and isolation and kind of guilt and shame at times, as well as kind of trying to reconcile and navigate your own identity in these kind of very different systems. And I thought that those were all very kind of powerful and very closely linked to mental health. The one other piece I'll just say on that is I think, while yes, there are these shared experiences, I think it's important to keep in mind that so much of these themes are very much rooted in the historical, the political, the social, the cultural context. And so while we see in the data that there's a lot of heterogeneity in terms of how different populations kind of present in terms of their mental health in situations of displacement. So I think it's good to recognize these similarities, but also kind of respect and acknowledge the differences in the context as well.
Yeah, I think that's really important to recognize both of those things, and the sort of the macro and micro level of the experiences that create this trauma. So you and I have spoken for hours in emails, across the past 4 or 5 months, talking about access to services, access to mental health services, and and whether they exist, and if they exist, and how people can access them. I was wondering if you could touch a little bit on that in regards to the Venezuelan diaspora that you're currently working with in partnership with HIAS. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think access is a huge issue, but the part to me that I think, again, the film did a beautiful job kind of portraying is just that even when services are available, there's often an element of kind of mistrust there. And the film, I think, showed really this, that the systems that are designed to protect people often do the opposite. And so I think part of that issue with access is kind of not only from what's available, but also what are people comfortable and what kinds of services are acceptable to the population. And when you're working in a system when you're kind of operating in a system where there is a little bit of mistrust that's sometimes adaptive, I think it's hard to overcome some of those barriers and challenges. We know from the mental health field that one of the challenges we face is that kind of the explanatory models, how people make meaning out of experience, how people react to kind of potentially traumatic events and adversity. That explanatory model differs so much across populations and cultures. And it's so imperative that the services that are available and that are accessible to these populations are consistent and aligned with those values and that meaning and those explanatory models. So a little bit of the work that we've been doing and a couple of models that I think have potential to address this issue. The first is really a task sharing or task shifting model that we've used in several different contexts where we train members of the community in kind of basic skills to address kind of mental health and psychosocial needs of their community members. And I think that model really came out of a need to address the kind of human workforce shortage in terms of mental health providers. But a really lovely consequence of that is that by kind of elevating and amplifying the voices of the refugee community to shape these mental health services, it kind of also ensures that they're more in line or more consistent with those cultural values and those explanatory models. So to me, I think what I've tried to incorporate into my work is really doing just that, trying to ensure that the kind of local tacit knowledge of these communities is leveraged in order to maximize the appropriateness and trust, as well as the acceptability of the response.
I've got a quick question on, so this has been a consistent question through, when people signed up and to see this panel, and I see themes of this in the Q&A. So how can trust be fostered in destination countries? What can we start to do as individuals that are perhaps in these host countries, and what can governments do? What can humanitarian agencies do?
Yeah, I mean, it's such an important question. And I think the answer is still kind of engaging with the right stakeholders, right? With members of the community to be in those initial kind of frontline workers to help to shape the supports and the systems that are available to refugees and to displaced populations. So it's hard. We've seen in several kind of different contexts that people feel a lot more comfortable talking about their vulnerabilities with people that they share either their cultural background with or other aspects of their identity. And so trying to kind of build those connections so that they're working with members of their community to address these problems, as opposed to relying on these systems that are often inconsistent with their cultural values or meaning around what they've gone through, I think can be a really valuable strategy for that.
Is it, I mean, if I may, Claire, the way that Amin opened up to the woman, I guess, social worker, the woman who was assigned to him, I bet that that's not typical amongst refugee, populations, because of the reason you just mentioned. People tend to expose their vulnerabilities to people that they feel there is some kinship with. So again, without giving away too much, how unusual is that? Amin is an unusual person, right? And you get to know him through this movie, and you get to love him, really. So yeah, I'd love to hear from you, sort of, to what extent can that experience be extrapolated, if at all?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I think that there's a lot of heterogeneity even within populations, right? In terms of people's comfort with disclosure and comfort with people that they might not trust for various reasons. And I think part of that has to do with what they experience leading up to that encounter, right? And their experiences with different either humanitarian actors or government officials, et cetera. So I think there's so much variation in terms of how people would respond in that type of situation. But I think there's a lot of room to improve how those processes happen so that it does kind of break down some of the kind of cultural barriers and other acceptability issues.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Claire, I've got one last question here for you. What part of the movie of Flee really, there's so many parts, right? But what part really stands out to you that is your takeaway?
Yeah, that's so good. To me, it was really the thing that I found so powerful was just how the experiences kind of built on each other. It wasn't that, and these other characters, went through this really traumatic or potentially traumatic event of displacement, but that was kind of so linked to his experience as a child with losing his father and, not understanding where his father was. And like all of these pieces that really built the story of his life, I think was quite powerful to me and really, really beautifully done, Jonas. I think it was such a good portrayal of kind of the complexity and the multidimensionality of people's lived experience, and that we can't really take this, universal approach to thinking about needs in these populations, because your identities and your social context, while dynamic, are so much linked across the life course. So that wasn't a direct answer to your question, Taylor, but I think it was really just the way it was all put together that I found really inspiring and touching.
I agree completely with you. The layers were something that you got to investigate in yourself and finding those feelings in yourself, and then also in the film. It's beautifully done. So Madeline, I've got some questions for you today. Thank you so much for joining us. So I want to start to ask you some questions in regards to also access. So insufficient access to mental health and psychosocial support services and related barriers can have a profound impact on an individual's ability to integrate into the resettlement country. So how can assistance for resettled refugees be strengthened? And what type of psychosocial approach should be adopted to facilitate their healing and integration? So I'm sort of curious to see your thoughts from the framework of coming from multilateral, and perhaps you can highlight some experiences in the field that you've also had.
Thank you, Taylor. And let me also really thank you and the Collaboratory, everybody who's given me the privilege and the pleasure of taking part in this gathering today. And let me also congratulate Jonas and everyone who's been involved in the film. I hope and believe that this is going to really touch many people in a way that news stories and the large global discussions around refugees doesn't necessarily do. And this is really important to mobilize people, to engage, to reach out, to provide some of the kinds of support that I think the film really underlines is crucial to enable refugees to restart their lives and to be able to start to contribute again to the communities that bring them in. But to focus on your question in particular, this is such a crucial issue. I mean, what we see at UNHCR is that mental health issues are an incredibly serious problem that results really in many ways inherently from the experience of being displaced. The sense of disorientation, the trauma caused by loss of home, often loss of family, loss of livelihoods, of many things that people associate with their identities. A lot of this is taken away from many refugees. There are also the risks associated with the journey in so many instances, as we saw in the film, traveling irregularly in dangerous means. And of course, there's concerns about the future and what that holds. And this places an enormous set of strains on people's mental health and well-being. So it's increasingly recognized by governments, by international actors, that building in mental health and psychosocial support is a crucial part of refugee protection and assistance. It's something that we recognize needs to be part and parcel of our responses when we're dealing with people who first flee across borders and in large-scale refugee settlements. We're seeking to strengthen that. I'll be frank, it's often a problem because some of the countries that welcome refugees, some of the countries often in the immediate neighborhood surrounding countries from which they fled, themselves have very strained health sectors and mental health sectors in particular. So here we are as the international community urging them to allow refugees to get access to national services, to national treatment programs, when those programs themselves are often very, very under-resourced. And so this really highlights the need for the international community to better support countries in regions of origin to be able to step up their services to meet the needs of host communities as well as refugees themselves who so badly need this. So what we see really is that when refugees are resettled, it is important that they continue to have access to mental health support, because the story is not over, of course, for many of them. In fact, it may be only after people are resettled, only when they come to a place of safety, that many of their trauma and many of their fears start to come out. And so it's really crucial that they have that support available there. This can be a real problem even in countries that are wealthy, because the sort of support that people, particularly people who may have experienced violence or trauma, are undergoing, is not always something that many mental health practitioners are able to provide. It's a particular area of expertise. I'm sure Claire could tell us more about this. But nonetheless, we really urge governments to look at making sure that that sector is sufficiently strengthened to meet the specific needs of refugees, which are often very particular. But they also often have more general mental health needs that can be addressed. Anxiety, so sorts of trauma that children have often when they're seeking to integrate, when they're feeling dislocated. These are things that can actually be addressed also through a welcoming environment and aware teachers and school authorities, through the sorts of programs that some neighborhoods offer as well. So this is a crucial part of it. I think the bottom line here is that really mental health and psychosocial support needs of refugees are increasingly recognized as a crucial area that needs more resources and needs more prioritization. But there's a lot of work that still needs to be done to take it forward.
I'm following up on the question of the statement you made about strategies that you guys are using. I was wondering if you could highlight a few that UNHCR and or the UN is currently using, and then can you also share how others that are not a part of these organizations can also support the strategies that you guys are using?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, I'm very glad to say that this isn't something that we see as an issue that one UN agency or indeed any one entity can solve by themselves. It really has to be a collaborative effort. So it really is something where UNHCR works with other agencies in the UN family, WHO, obviously, but also UNICEF with its mandate for support and protection of children, UN Women, which has a crucial role to play, noting that a very significant proportion of refugee populations worldwide are women, and sometimes they are exposed particularly to violence and trauma along the way. We also work with national authorities in host countries that are hosting refugees. And this is really a crucial area, as I've said, because a lot of the time it's about ensuring not that refugees have parallel programs specially set up for them. It's about making sure they can have access to facilities that are available in the countries that host them so that they can interact also with other communities, so that countries that are hosting particularly large refugee populations have the sense they're being supported, and that it is not to their detriment, but rather in their interest to also welcome and afford access to refugees. So this idea that really this is about assisting host communities as well as refugees is an important part of the strategy. But sending the message also that this isn't just up to countries that are hosting refugees in the first place, that they shouldn't be expected to deal with this alone, that this really is a question of solidarity amongst states worldwide, that the donor community has to help, that countries that can resettle refugees can also play an important role, is a crucial part of this, because we see some people who in particular simply can't find a solution in the first country to which they've fled. And that's why resettlement, whether that's to countries in North America, in Australasia, or in Europe, is a crucial route, because sometimes people, including people who have mental health needs, often simply can't find the treatment and the support they need to be able to overcome their challenges. So resettlement becomes a crucial part of all of that. And if I may say so, we're at a point right now where this is a particularly challenging area, because in the past, UNHCR has had very large resettlement programs that have been offered places for people in countries that have been ready to take tens of thousands of refugees. Resettlement was effectively suspended during COVID, and we're having trouble now getting back up to the numbers that we need to be able to deal with those people who aren't safe or who can't find ways to rebuild their lives in the first countries to which they have fled. So we need resettlement to step up and more efforts to be made in that regard. Thank you.
I really appreciate that. And so just one final question here for you. What part of the film did you particularly feel connected to? What was the thing that you were left with?
Oh, there really were many. And I mean, if I can speak a bit about what the film brought to me, I think what I really liked was the way in which, although it was the story of one person, it really in many ways universalizes and brings very vividly to life the experience of so many refugees in so many situations around the world. Of course, we were talking about one man from one country, but really, his experience is similar to that which we see of Rohingya who have fled from Myanmar, of what we see now for refugees who are in some parts of the Horn of Africa. And amongst those, I mean, in particular, I think Safwan spoke about the moment in the back of the truck, about the way in which refugees can often help each other. And that is a crucial part of them surviving along this incredibly difficult trajectory. I think also the experiences of what he recalls about his homeland before he was forced to flee, that really speaks to a lot of the nostalgia that people have for the country they are forced to leave. Even if it's a place where they've experienced terrible events, often this really is a crucial part of their identity, and they want to be able to hold on to those memories. In some cases, some people hope to be able to return one day, and a really important part of our work in the refugee community is to seek to try and make sure that we can create the conditions for that to occur wherever it's possible. We all hope that this is going to be something available for many refugees who are forced to flee. I think also the way in which he connected with people finally in Europe, where he found protection, and his significant other, of course, that really speaks to the universality of love and the fact that this can be such a crucial part also for all of us in being able to find a future, even when we've gone through incredibly difficult experiences. Thank you.
Completely agree. Miriam, Miriam is Miriam is a friend of mine, and we met through helping out our friends.
Friendship was born in the trenches of last August.
Yes, the trenches. So good, and so happy to have you be here today.
I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
So, I know you watched the film, and I know that you and I, offline, you spoke so highly of it, and I want to. So that brings me to my first question. So recently, many films are being produced by Afghan filmmakers that narrate the harrowing journey of Afghans seeking safety. So can you tell me who are making these films and how they're being made? And what kind of care is being taken when sharing these kinds of stories? Can you talk a little bit about that, based on your experiences as someone who's Afghani and also, who's an artist working with other artists?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think because of what has happened over the last, six odd months, there are a number of films currently in production, in post by now, probably also that are looking at the journeys that people have taken over this time, some of which are extremely harrowing and traumatic, but actually very few of them are being made by Afghan filmmakers. Most of them have Afghan subjects, but aren't being made by Afghan filmmakers. And I think, what's striking about Flee is the care that was taken in the making of it, which I really appreciated. And I hope that similar care is being taken in the making of all of these stories. Although I will remain skeptical until I see the results, because it is very difficult to make these kinds of stories with the proper duty of care to your subjects. And I'm sure Jonas knows that. It's when you're talking about so many, the kinds of journeys that people have taken that are extremely difficult to go through and then to recall even at a distance of many years. And then when you're doing it, when they're so fresh or when people are still in the midst of them, the ethics of making films about that are extremely complicated and fraught. I don't know. I don't have firsthand knowledge of most of these projects, and I will be very interested to see what comes of them. Yes.
I think that's really interesting to see what the outcomes will be from it. Sort of understanding how it supports these individuals, supports what they're going through. These are really important things to think about and consider. So art gives the refugee plight a human face. So I want you to speak sort of, freely on that theme about, what role can art play in creating, and changing society? I know as a professor at Bennington that you probably have these kind of conversations a lot with your students. But I wanted to, give you the floor to talk about this.
Right. Yeah. I'll say one thing about this, and then I actually have a couple of questions that I want to put to Jonas. One thing I'll say about that is that I personally think art is always just a wedge, like the tip of an iceberg. It can open people's minds, but then you have to do a lot of work in collaboration with other people to get actual results in the world beyond just starting some kind of conversation. And I think that's what in the documentary world we now call impact campaigns. And I believe this conversation is part of the impact campaign around this film. Yeah, that's probably what's happening. I think, as artists, it's very difficult for us to make change alone. And most of us who want to make change recognize that. And we try to work with other people who are on the ground already trying to make these changes in the world and have them, use whatever art we're making to draw attention to the efforts that they're already in the process of undertaking, right? Art can kind of put a spotlight on things and help them, be a little bit louder. But it's very difficult, I think, for an artwork to by itself do any more than like open a little crack in somebody's mind that other things can enter into. The thing that I found really interesting in Flee actually is it's thinking around narrative, and the way that it looks at how refugees have to narrate themselves and make themselves legible to asylum systems, and how narrow the scope for those narratives is, and what exactly is legible to those systems. And to me, that was the most kind of fascinating part of the film, and the way that it considers both, what kinds of trauma are legible to these systems and what kinds of trauma and violence aren't, like, short, sharp shocks versus slow trauma and slow violence. And then, also the kind of violence that is done by cramming your story into this tiny legible format, right? And I guess the question I had for Jonas was about how do you balance, creating this kind of narrative critique with also making a story that is itself legible to a wide audience? Like, how did you approach that?
No, but it's of course a simplified version of his story. But the process of making a film was really, for Amin, as much, just sharing his story, just the act of sharing his story with me was kind of the most important thing for him, because for so many years he hadn't been able to share his story. And then, of course, I had to kind of find a path through the story that he gave me, this testimony, because it takes place during more than 30 years. So I had to find a path and a focus for it. And that became the meaning of home. And really, I tried to find, sequences from this testimony that kind of supported this story about, being a refugee, about losing your home, and always being on the search for a place where you feel safe again. So it was really about trying to support that story. And I had, involved, throughout the process of making the film. He watched edits, he would see designs, he would, read the kind of scripts I did. I transcribed all the interviews and put it into a document, and he would read that. So he kind of saw what was in there, so he felt represented. But it's really a balancing act to make documentaries, and as you said as well, because there's this kind of you have a responsibility towards your subject, but also towards the production, and like, where do you go? And you need to be right between. You need to be honest and be clear what path you're taking. So it was super important for me to have in there all along. Yeah.
So that brings me to the next question, actually, Miriam. So, in our conversations, I've often said that you're a part of protecting the history of Afghanistan. Art is a part of the history of a country, and and the work that you've been doing, and us in the trenches of helping with the evacuation. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where things are at right now, and what you're doing, and how other people can help.
Sure. Yeah. Well, in regards to like where Afghans might be able to see this film, I can tell you that the biggest concentration of Afghan artists and filmmakers is now in Germany. So you definitely organize something there. There's also a little community forming in France. So those are the two countries where people are actually ending up for the most part. So definitely we could talk about that if you want to screen it for people.
We should do something at the Paris Global Center.
Yeah, we could definitely make that happen. So yes, there's been a lot of people involved in the effort to try and help Afghan artists and cultural workers, because I think, as everyone is aware, the Taliban has historically been very hostile to the arts. And to the pre-Islamic history of Afghanistan. They are iconoclasts in the true sense of the word, in that they have been, part of their project has been, in general, to deny that there is any pre-Islamic history of Afghanistan, even though we do have a very long and complicated history, which has many, many things in it besides Islam. So they have often tried to erase all those other aspects of our history, including artifacts, including our archaeological museum, including, as everyone knows, the Buddhas of Bamyan in the 90s, including targeting religious and ethnic minorities, and including, suppressing the visual arts, and firing all the cultural workers in the government. So there have been a number of efforts to kind of help these people find new places to live and work and thrive and continue making work, and to prevent the interruption of our artistic and cultural traditions. Ways in which people can help include continuing to help advocate for more visas, for artists and cultural workers, because there have been very few allotted for these people, very, very few. Continuing to advocate for also support for people who are remaining in the country to be protected, to advocate for the protection of cultural heritage in the country, to make sure that there's still attention being paid to that so it isn't destroyed, to also continue to support artists and cultural workers when they arrive in new countries, not just simply as refugees, but as artists, to provide forums for their work. As with everyone who comes to a new country, when you start over, your identity again is narrowed. You become nothing but a refugee, right? And that's also a violence when what you do, and as an artist, what you do is who you are, right? And when that's stripped from you, it's incredibly violent. So to help artists continue making art is an incredible support for them, not just financial, but spiritual, really.
So my final question here for you is, what part of the film especially, especially touched you, that you walked away with? And, I think it's given your background and, Afghani artists, and having a history of a family that's been a part of the diaspora, you yourself, I was curious, what part really captured your heart?
I guess there were two. It's a sort of two-part answer. One part was when they're in Russia and waiting for the money, and having to split up and go separately because the money is being raised so slowly. And that really reminded me of my childhood and us bringing people over one by one. As we could raise the money. That's an experience that many people in my generation had. And it's definitely one that I had personally. And the other was, I think, the same scene that Safwan mentioned with in Sweden, where his brother takes him to the club. Which that was beautiful. That was a really beautiful scene, a little twist, an unexpected twist. That was lovely. I'll say one more thing, which is just, I think artworks have always had more mobility than artists. And in the way that this film is traveling, which is beautiful, I only wish that Amin had been able to travel as easily as this film does.
Thank you for that. Thank you so much. And so I'm going to speak a little bit really quickly on LGBTQIA Afghans. So currently working with about 600 Afghans that are a member of this community that have not been able to leave. And I know everyone, the experience of being a migrant, refugee, displaced person is all very similar. But I want to bring up that if you're part of this community, not only are you dealing with discrimination as being a displaced person, a migrant, but I call it doubling up almost. You know, you're dealing with biphobia, transphobia, homophobia, and often diasporas that you go into are more conservative. And so you don't get the community support. So the story of Amen was especially touching for me and for my partner, who is from Lebanon, and, you know, telling the story of acceptance and, you know, when his brother, you know, I even get touched now when his brother, you know, took him to the bar. This is not everyone's experience. It's actually quite opposite. And you often see mental health issues, disparities. You also see a lack of productivity, a lack of access to care, fear about coming out, which is violence on its own on top of all the trauma and violence that they've experienced. So I just also want to share that. And you know, everyone can be in tune to that and help support different communities that, you know, come to countries in which they're resettling. So I know that we've got a lot of questions in the Q&A. And so Jonas, of course, we've got a lot of people asking some questions. The first one is, where can we access and watch the documentary?
Well, of course, depending on where you are. In the US, it's out now on streaming and in cinemas. And I think they're going to widen the release now after the nominations. And it's sold to most of the world. So it should be accessible during this winter, spring, summer.
Awesome. So I think we actually have a question from a student who is a part of the
Yes.
yes. Yeah. So Shannon, if you want to go ahead and introduce her.
Sure. Thanks, Taylor. It is really an honor to introduce our student today, Valerie Pyers, who's an undergraduate student who will be asking the live question. Now, Valerie is currently in her second semester at Columbia, pursuing a BA in Film and Media Studies at the School of General Studies. She is also an investigative journalist and a documentary photographer and filmmaker. She's worked in broadcast journalism and documentary filmmaker in the US and abroad, and recently won a one-year fellowship from the prestigious Pulitzer Center for a project she developed entitled Off Track: LGBTQI Refugees Find Shelter and Support in Greece. Welcome to Valerie, and we're looking forward to your question.
Thank you, Shannon. What a great panel, incredible. First of all, I would like to congratulate Jonas and the team behind Flee for an incredibly well-crafted and moving film, a film full of difficult choices, and yet it seems all the right ones were made, so congratulations. The film addresses the long and arduous process of migration and resettlement for any refugee. But my question regards specifically how the world sees forced migration today and how we can get global organizations to consider forced migration due to various reasons, from war to gender persecution to climate change, not an individual crisis stemming from an isolated event, but instead a permanent and an ongoing reality. In other words, how could reframing the definition of forced migration could make a positive impact on how international organizations tackle it? Thank you.
Madeline, let's actually start with you to answer that question, if that's okay.
With who, Taylor? It wasn't clear.
Madeline.
Madeline.
Madeline, can we start with you to answer that question?
Thank you, Taylor. And really, thank you for that question. I think it speaks to many of the very serious challenges we're facing here. Taylor talked in his introduction, indeed, about the many complex reasons why people move. And of course, the reality is that many of us, I think, also taking part in this event today are migrants in some way or another. Many of us spend time and may even permanently shift from where we were born and brought up, and we've all experienced some of the insecurity and fear and disorientation of being in new places. So I think to the extent to which we can also try to tap into empathy and to recognition of the fact that this is a phenomenon that's always been a part of human history. It's a part of the way in which many of us live and work today, and it can bring enormous benefits to receiving communities. This is particularly important. But I think, when you speak about reframing, particularly the ideas around forced displacement, this is a really important question, because the situation of refugees is different to that of people who move with a degree of choice. What we know and what we saw so graphically displayed in the film also is that refugees are people who are forced to flee, whether it's due to persecution, serious risks of human rights violations, conflict, massive discrimination. These are elements which can bring you within the definition of a refugee in the 1951 Convention, and which mean that you have specific rights. And what's unique about refugees is that they can't go home because of the risks they would face if they were forced to do so. And so whilst I think it's very important indeed, we need to look at how we can frame these things differently in order to bring about different reactions to the challenges that displacement in particular and refugee movements create. We do need to hold on to some of these key elements, which is that these people have important rights, and these have been rights which have been enshrined in international treaties for very powerful reasons. I mean, I think it's interesting when one looks at this sphere, because we at UNHCR, we have a lot of discussions with governments about the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees, which is the main international instrument which defines states' obligations. And it's been ratified, it and its protocol from 1967 have been ratified by 149 states. So that's, that's almost 3/4 of the UN member states' membership. So it's very widely ratified. And sometimes states tell us that they think the Refugee Convention is outdated, no longer fit for purpose. It was put in place after World War II, and things are different today. We need to look at changing it. But in response to that, I think we at UNHCR would point to the fact that actually it's demonstrated over and over throughout the last 70 years its ongoing relevance and its applicability to modern challenges that we see. I think it's interesting that states tell us, and states and other critics tell us that they think it's outdated, because implied in that critique is somehow this idea that when states adopted the Refugee Convention, they were feeling generous and they were better equipped to take in refugees and host them. But of course, history shows us that it could not be further from the truth. In the immediate years after World War II, of course, they're talking about a group of states that were sitting there together, real tensions between them. They'd been at war in the years previously, many of them. Europe was in economic and physical ruin. And yet they saw the crucial need to put in place a definition of people who need protection, people facing a well-founded fear of persecution because of race, religion, nationality, membership of a social group or political opinion. And they saw the need to undertake binding commitments towards them. So we today, with our resources, with our multilateral frameworks, with our sophisticated government systems and infrastructures, we, I think, cannot say that we are not in a position to honor those commitments. And as global reality shows us, we certainly cannot say that there are not people who need protection. The refugee definition has evolved over time, and it's been shown by courts worldwide to be applicable and to be interpreted in ways which take account of things that the drafters at the time didn't explicitly recognize. Gender-based forms of persecution, child-specific forms of persecution, children who are recruited forcibly, people who are persecuted based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. These are recognized in the definition of people who are persecuted as members of a social group. So I think, yes, we do need to look at representing the importance of addressing these challenges, but we can't lose sight, and we should continue to speak to the enduring relevance and the importance of upholding these crucial principles that were laid down so many years ago. Thanks.
Thank you, Valerie, for your question, and Madeline. So, Jonas, I've got a question here for you from the Q&A. What was the audience that you expected that you made the film for? What audience did you have in mind?
Basically everyone. This film really comes from a friendship. I didn't kind of wanted to do a refugee story and then went out and found a refugee and then did a story about him. This really comes from a fundamental kind of curiosity about my friend. And to me, you know, also to answer a little bit the question before, what I can do and what I try to do is, you know, is create connections, like through arts, and to kind of show open worlds and show that how alike we are. And this thing also to echo Miriam, you know, that you can't put a refugee in a box of being a refugee. Like Amin is a refugee, yes, or he was a refugee. He's not anymore, and he built a new life for himself, and just kind of show the nuance. And because his story is told from the inside of a friendship, I was really hoping that I could give some nuance and show, you know, some of the other side that's also him, and that's very human. So to me, it's, you know, really about creating connections, telling stories that are humans, that are human, and I think that should go for everyone. So to me, this film is something everyone should see. Of course not. I have a daughter who's 7, and maybe that's a little early to her for her to kind of see this. But I've screened it for, you know, young teenagers who really connect to it, and I think that's what I can do, and I hope that, you know, just to connect people is what I'm trying to do.
That's great that you had the, you know, you're talking about a friendship and showing it to the world. That must be a very vulnerable and touching tribute to your friendship. I think it's amazing to see that. So got a question for you, Claire. We've had some questions about using, let's see, have you tried an intermodule expressive arts method for providing mental health support? And have you seen the dynamics of trust change in that? It's a great question. Have you? Yeah.
It's a great question, kind of bringing the themes of this panel together in arts and mental health. I mean, so I can put my kind of scientific hat on for a minute and say, you know, I think kind of art as a form of healing has been used in many places, but we don't know a lot from kind of the scientific evidence about how effective that is or any sort of impacts. But I will say, kind of from the work that I've done in different communities, I think one thing we continue to hear from communities is the power of bringing people together to express their experience and share experiences in a culturally meaningful way. And I think art as a mechanism, as a platform to do that can be really incredibly valuable, particularly for kind of strengthening those kind of social networks and social connections between people, both within the refugee communities and between refugee and host communities as well. So while we don't necessarily from the kind of scientific perspective, I think know a lot, I think there's a lot of room to build on that. But from kind of the, in terms of the connections between art and mental health as a form of expression and collective expression, I think it's quite valuable.
Like that. I like your viewpoint on that, how the intersectionality is so valuable to the experience for mental health and how you can use that for change. So we've got a lot of questions in here about talking about the lens of coming from the global north and having those sort of opinions of, you know, how are we actually doing a good job of telling the story if we're from a privileged global north setting? I want to actually throw that to Miriam, actually. What is, yeah, I know you kind of touched on that, but what are your thoughts on that?
Wow, thanks, Taylor. Yeah, I mean, obviously this is, I was looking at the Q&A also, it's this question of like, for whom was the film made? Right? Which I think is a valid question. It's like, for whom is this, like, who is the intended audience of this film? And like, when I was watching this, I didn't necessarily think this was a film that was made primarily for an Afghan audience, although I think an Afghan diasporic audience will really enjoy it. But I don't know that an Afghan audience in Afghanistan is the primary audience for this film. But I don't know what Jonas has to say to that.
No, but of course, it's Amin's subjective story seen through my lens, and I'm born here in Denmark. So of course it is for us to have a window into the refugee experience. But, you know, again, it's not just the refugee experience, it's also this experience of being gay in Afghanistan and like not being able to be honest to who you are. So I think it's a universal story in many ways, because yes, it's about the flight from Afghanistan to Denmark, and yes, it's about a refugee, but it's also about, you know, not being able to be honest to who you are and looking for the place in the world where you feel you can be who you are with everything that entails. And I think that's a universal story. I didn't have a specific audience in mind while making the film. It really came from the friendship, you know. It came from a fundamental curiosity from my side and him wanting to share his story. And it became kind of symbiotic in the process of making the film. I didn't think, I didn't have a specific audience. To me, it's really about open worlds. Like through him, through our friendship, I hope to open up worlds to what it's like to be, yes, a refugee, being gay, and not being able to be fully who you are. And again, just to create connectivity, you know. So I really hope that people who don't have any experience of being refugees see this and get a human face to the experience and see how nuanced it is, and that being a refugee is not an identity, you know, it's something you go through. And also that, you know, what here in Denmark, at least, we call it a refugee crisis. I guess in the US, you call it a migrant crisis, and we should really call it a humanitarian crisis, you know, because, and we should treat it as such, because as soon as we call it a refugee crisis, we kind of detach from it and just see, okay, but we are all in the same boat. So that's a long answer, but you know, really, to me, it is a story for everyone, also for Afghans to see, okay, but you can have a gay family member and it can be okay. And it's important for Danish people to see, okay, but refugees are a lot more than refugees.
Juan, I wanted your thoughts on this.
Thank you, Taylor. I mean, I'm listening to this, and you know, I'm from the global south. I'm from Jordan originally, and I don't think that one should be apologetic for bringing in a lens that may be from the global north or the global south. I mean, you know, Jonas is from the global north, and you know, he's friends with Amin, and he's a filmmaker, and that's the way it is. And you take it at face value. And this was in many ways a collaboration with Amin. I mean, you know, I felt that Amin was as much a filmmaker as you were, Jonas. And I think, I mean, I'm not an artist, but I think that when you know, I'm an author, and when you produce art, you don't produce it for a specific audience, do you? Right? I mean, you know, you produce it, and you hope that people will read in it and see in it, and it speaks to them in whatever ways resonate with them. And I'm sure, yes, there is universality, but I am also confident that, for example, Flee, there are moments in it that spoke to me perhaps very differently than they might to somebody who grew up in the global north. But you know, I identified with it. I grew up gay in Jordan, you know, in a similar period, and you know, a lot of the experience and a lot of the context I also related to. So, you know, I think it's important not to become sort of over encumbered with, you know, which prism are we looking at this from?
I really appreciate you mentioning that, Safwan, and mentioning the, you know, talking about yourself and your experiences as someone from the global south, but also as a member of the LGBTQI community. So, Madeline, you wanted to make a comment there. I wanted to go ahead and.
Yeah, thanks very much, Taylor. No, I just wanted to react to this because I think it really is important for all of us in many different sectors of our work to ensure that the voices of refugees themselves can be heard more. And it needs to be recognized that they are playing incredibly important leadership roles, that they are making incredibly important contributions in any number of situations worldwide, notwithstanding some of the enormous challenges that they face. This is something where I can certainly say the UN and UNHCR in particular needs to be doing much more. We talk about this, but we need to improve. There's no question about this. There's a saying that some of our refugee-led organizations have, which says there's nothing about us without us. And that's really something that we have to acknowledge and we need to pay more attention to. UNHCR's high-level meetings with states now feature much more prominent leadership roles for refugees themselves, speaking directly to states. And this is crucial to give validity to the sort of work we're doing here. So, you know, this is something where I don't want to defend what we're doing because it's just not enough. It's something that we really need to work on further, and I hope that in the future we'll improve on that. And it's something that everyone working in this sector or committed to this area, I think, should also be mindful of in doing this work. Thank you.
And thank you for that. And I would like to add something to that. You know, as we tell these stories, I know in my experiences in the field that you also need to compensate those whose stories are being told, that they are in situations of displacement and economic vulnerabilities. So I think we also all have a responsibility to think about that as well. So I want to go ahead and bring this over to concluding remarks. Shannon, I believe we're heading to you first for that, or are we going to Safwan?
We're going to Safwan first, and then
Safwan. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Safwan, please.
I thought we were going to Shannon, but that's fine. Shannon and I, are interchangeable to a very large extent. I mean, I don't know what to say. Thank you. I'm in awe of all of you, really, for the work that you do and for everything that you have contributed to this. And Valerie, I really loved your question, loved having you be with us. So thank you. In particular, it's always great to have, young minds, students who are thinking about these things. I want to, I finished watching it and I was like, I want to go to Copenhagen and I want to meet Jonas and I want to meet Amin, and I feel like I already have. And it was just such an incredibly touching movie. And, I was speaking with a friend who I think is watching today. And we spoke while he was watching it. He said, "This is so sad. This is so sad." I said, "Yeah, it is. But stay with it till the end, because it's also beautiful and it's also hopeful. And I think you've done an incredible thing with that, because in every travesty, I think in every situation, there is hope. There is something positive that comes out of it. And if nothing else, at least it is the raising of consciousness, for people like us. But, all of you are doing such incredible work, and, working with refugees and from Afghanistan in particular, as Taylor knows, is something that's very dear to myself and to colleagues at Columbia. We've orchestrated a response to the Afghanistan crisis by offering to host a number of Afghan scholars at a number of schools. And one of them, by the way, Jonas, is a filmmaker whose name I don't have here in front of me, but an Afghan filmmaker who made it to Paris. And there's going to be some language difficulties, but he is being hosted at Columbia at the School of the Arts, and he's working with Professor Hamid Dabashi, and is going to be helping and guest speaking and giving lectures in a number of classes. And here, even in Amman, Jordan, we're hosting remotely for the time being 3 Afghan scholars whom we could not get the visas for to come to Jordan, but we're figuring out whether we can host them at one of the other global center sites. But all of this, pales in comparison to the expertise and the work that you're doing on the humanitarian front, on the mental health front, on the legal front, whether within the UN, outside of the UN. So I'm inspired by all of you. And I just had one question, Jonas. The necklace, is it the same one? Because you do,
yeah.
I mean, okay.
Yeah.
That's even more touching. So, And I think, those sort of, little, so it's many stories, and it's many human stories blended into one. So it is very much about fleeing Afghanistan. It is very much about the very, very, very sad situation that's been we've been living with, Afghans have been living with for the past few decades. But it's also a very individual story, and it's a family story, and it's a story about sexuality and openness and honesty and integrity and love. And anyway, I could go on and on, so I'm going to stop and turn it over to Shannon, but just say thank you to all of you.
Yes, thank you, Safwan. And wow, we've had an engaging discussion on forced migration today through the lens of an Oscar-nominated director and renowned experts. We've talked about addressing mental health, resettlement programs, what refugees recall about their homeland, and how it's crucial to be a part of the identity, and how the film Flee tells the story about one man fleeing Afghanistan, but brings to life the experience of many refugees from around the world. This was the second seminar in a series of seminars focused on Afghanistan, delivered as part of the Global Columbia Collaboratory, a virtual exchange platform that's bringing Columbia students, thought leaders, and educators from around the globe together to reflect, ideate, and collaborate to make an impact. We're looking forward to our next collaboratory seminar, so please keep an eye out for the announcement. And thanks again to our esteemed panelists who joined us today, Jonas, Claire, Miriam, and Madeline, and to our amazing moderator, Taylor. And many thanks to the team at Columbia Global Centers, Columbia World Projects, Columbia College, and the Center for Undergraduate Global Engagement. And of course, we want to extend our very special thank you to our collaboratory students, including Valerie, who joined us giving a question live. We have partners and participants from around the world who also participated today. A reminder that a link to the recording of the full webinar will be sent to everyone who registered. And for others, you'll be able to find it on our website. Thank you and be well.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.